Hey class. Crazy that it's already the eighth week, and that this is our last discussion post. Um, but going off of the first question, starting everything off, from what God said in Hosea 1:4, what can we say about Ju Jehu's actions? I'm definitely not pronouncing that right, but after reading and doing some research and kind of just thinking about this, I think that um, the actions that happened were actions um, that had God behind them, and a lot of it's kind of weird. It's weird to say that because there was a lot of violence and anger and um, just kind of killing and death around all of it, and but it's what God wanted. 2 Kings 10:30 says, "The Lord said to Judah, because you have done well in accomplishing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab um, all I had in mind to do, your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel to the fourth generation." And then immediately in the next verse, it says, "Yet Judah was not careful to keep the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all of his heart. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, which he had caused Israel to commit." Um, so yeah, all of his actions were, I think, warranted by God and had God behind them, but um, he still found a way to go away from what God wanted him to do. Um, I think it's a kind of a theme of the Kings. We see almost like a power hungry way of thinking, and it can really get in their head and really mess up their decision making as far as uh, obeying what God is telling them and how they do so. Um, yeah, it was definitely interesting. Like I said, I think the thing that I was struggling with the most and trying to wrap my head around as I was reading this was just how violent it really was, and um, how violent it really was, but also how it was coming from God. Um, and I think it's just one of those passages and one of those readings that you read, and it's the harsh reality of kind of these hard things to read about God, and sometimes that it's not all butterflies and rainbows, and it gets very, very real, and God is going to do what God thinks needs to be done because He ultimately knows best. But yeah, those are my thoughts on that question. I'm going to break this one up, so there's going to be some weird transitions in between the questions. All right, so for the second question, what part of Manasseh's story was not included in Second Kings? In Second Kings, we hear, or Second Kings 21, we read about King Manasseh, who isn't the best king. He is actually really bad king. Um, a couple of highlights of his career, if you could say. Um, he he brought child sacrifice into play. He introduced worshiping idols. Um, let's see, some other things the Second Chronicles said. Practiced divination, divination and witchcraft, sought omens, and consulted mediums and spirits. Basically, anything that wasn't uh, God is what Manasseh was doing. Um, so, putting those two and making him king, he makes him not a very good king. And we can read all about that in Second Kings, but in Second Chronicles, there is an account um, where, let's see, it is verse 11. So the Lord brought against them the army of commanders of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh as prisoner, put a hook in his nose and bound him with bronze shackles and took him to Babylon. So verse 12, in his distress he sought out the favor of the Lord and God and humbled himself greatly before the Lord of ancestors. So we have this kind of like almost Paul Damascus Road encounter where Manasseh is like realizing that like he messed up um, as he's in prison, and turns back to the Lord, humbles himself before the Lord. And it kind of changes this. So in verse 14, you read down, it says, "Afterward, he rebuilt the outer wall of the city of David, west of the Gideon Spring, in the valley as far as the entrance um, of the fish gate. And then he got rid of foreign gods, verse 15. He restored the altar in verse 16. And he was really trying to do these things to kind of bring the city back from what he kind of created, and make this city centered around God. Um, Unfortunately, verse 17, it says the people, however, continue to sacrifice at the high places, but only to the Lord their God. Um, there were still sacrifices going on, but there were sacrifices to the Lord. So I'm not sure like exactly what they mean by sacrifices when it says this in the verse. Assuming that they were good sacrifices. Assuming, I hope so. I'd have to do some more research into that. But yeah, it kind of, the account in Second Chronicles of um, Manasseh's story is definitely one that includes kind of his comeback, I think, because when we read about him in Second Kings, you just read all these really bad things and you realize that he's a really bad king, which he was. But in Second Chronicles, he has kind of a comeback story, and like I said, a Damascus Road encounter almost. And he continued his kingship. And it says in verse 20, Manasseh rested with his ancestors and was buried in his palace, and Amon his son succeeded him as king. So he didn't get killed. He lived his life out as king. So he did good enough to do that. I will be moving on. All right, and then the last question, question 3: why did Josiah die when he did? 2 Kings 22, verse 19, because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I had spoken against the place and its people, and they would become accursed and be laid waste. And because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I also have heard you, declare the Lord. Verse 20, therefore I will gather you to your ancestors, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see the disaster I'm going to bring to this place. So they took his answer back to the king. Basically what that is saying is Josiah was 8 years old and he became king. And it says that in first verse of 2 Kings 22. But he was 8 years old and he was actually a really good king, which is surprising for an 8-year-old, because I couldn't be a good king at 21. So props to him. But Josiah was a king who followed the Lord, and he was someone who followed David, or used David as an example per se in his ruling. And he was with the Lord. He made his decisions through the Lord, and unlike all these other kings who decide to dismiss God, he was one to embrace God, and he, because of that, ultimately kind of is not killed, but is saved. But in saving him, he dies, basically because God is about to put a major exile on his city, and like it says in verse 20, it says, your eyes will not see all the disaster I'm going to bring on this place. God didn't want him to see the disaster that was about to happen to his city, because he was such a good king, and unfortunately that means he dies. So he dies in battle by his enemy, but I can imagine that he died peacefully, because he says that you'll be buried in peace and with your ancestors. So it's very interesting that an 8-year-old was a better king than some of these other guys, and followed God better than some of these other guys. And I think it's a really cool example that youth is very powerful. I work in youth ministry, so I'm always going to find a way to say that the youth are powerful. But yeah, it's a very interesting story, and it's a very interesting way of dying, I think, for Josiah. But in the long run, God knows what's best for all of us, and this is an example of that. And sometimes it's hard to see for us, because we have our idea of what's best for people in our head, but ultimately God knows what's best. And for Josiah, it was him dying. So that is why he died when he did.